Greetings, everyone. Here we go with the last day of the classical era, and then we're going to be moving on to Romantic era, and specifically to get us into the Romantic era, talking about Beethoven. But let's dive right into this. Let's wrap up the classical era and wrap up our lectures for this week. So the first person we need to talk about for our two composers today is Joseph Haydn, who was born in Austria in 1732 and began his education as a choir boy, also learned harpsichord and violin. He eventually became a music director for Count Morzin in 1757, married Maria Keller, and though he wanted to marry her sister Josepha, but she became a nun, so that didn't work out very well. In 1761, he began working for Hungarian Prince Paul Esterhazy, and this gave him a lot of security in his life. What the pictures you see here are the Esterhazy Palace, and he had a chance to just be a full-time employee of them and write music for them. He did spend 5 years working in England, but through all his life he worked for the various Esterhazy royalty. And he composed weekly, presented concerts and operas every week. He helped organize daily chamber music, which chamber music is small music ensembles or small performances. And again, he worked at this estate, which is very much, it was kind of in response to Versailles. Remember the large palace in France? It had one theater for opera, it had one for plays, and a lot of different musical guests would come through, which he had the opportunity to learn from. And because of his security as an employee there, he was given a lot of freedom to experiment with his musical writing. He was originally not allowed to sell his music, but pirated copies of his music that made it throughout Europe. This is, you couldn't pirate CDs, but you could pirate compositions. Those made him famous in Europe. And later, he was allowed to sell his music, and as a shrewd businessman, since there were no copyright laws at the time, he would sell his music to multiple publishers in multiple countries at the same time. So he'd be making money from multiple publishers selling his music. He blended a lot of styles at the time. He was an extraordinarily clever writer. And the first thing I want you to listen to by him is his string quartet in E flat major, opus 33, number 2. And it's nicknamed The Joke, and you're going to hear why. It takes material from the first two measures and it uses it over and over again in new ways. It's got a really singable melody. And in the second section of it, you're going to hear multiple long, unresolved parts where the music keeps getting louder and softer, but it just hangs on to the harmony. It's like, finish it. You feel like it should be over. And he just plays with us over and over again. And at the end, you hear the theme, but he puts in some really big pauses, which just acknowledges, like, we expect something to happen, and he totally is like, psych, that's not what's going to happen here. It's really fantastic, and you can just imagine the audience chuckling, realizing that Haydn had totally just taken them for a ride. So I want you to listen to this string quartet in E flat major, opus 33, number 2, The Joke. Take a listen to it, and then come back and join us. So, as we've seen, Haydn had a humorous streak, which we also see in some of his symphonic writing as well. The next one I want you to listen to is Symphony No. 94, particularly Movement 2. Haydn set the standard that symphonies would take in the Romantic era, and after all, he was one of Beethoven's teachers. Haydn's symphonies had 4 movements. There was a fast sonata form section with a slow introduction. That's the first one. And remember, we talked about sonata form the other day. You've got an exposition with your 2 themes, one in the tonic key, one in the dominant key. Then you've got your development, which could be part of just section 2, which just plays around with different materials and keys. Then you've got your recapitulation, which is theme 1 and 2 again, but they're both in the tonic key. So anyways, his symphonies, your first movement of a symphony is usually going to be that. Then there's a slow movement, there's a minuet, which is a dance, and then a fast finale in sonata or rondo form, which rondo is this idea of, okay, I've got this section of music. It sounds like this. Then I do a new section of music. Then I go back to the first section. Then maybe I'll do a new section of music, but then I'll go back to the first section. It's alternating this one section of music with new material in a pattern. So anyways, as his style evolved, he started to include in his orchestra trumpets, timpani, and clarinets, and he started to give the woodwinds more independence instead of them just doubling the strings. So this is one of his later symphonies. It was written while he was in London, and I'd like you to listen to it again. It's Symphony number 94, and I want you to at least listen to movement 2. If you've never heard this before, a lot of you probably have, but if you haven't heard it before, don't follow the score initially. I want you to just listen to it so you can enjoy the surprises that he throws in. And if you have, look at the score as it plays on the video and see how he wrote it out. So again, because this is movement 2, this will be a slower movement. And you'll hear again, he takes a really, really small amount of musical material, just a little tune and a little harmony, and he develops it and stretches it out. It's almost like theme and variations, how much he plays with it. So the link you're going to click on in the YouTube video, it's the whole symphony, but if you look in the description below, there's a little link that you can click on that takes you right to the second movement. So take a listen to the second movement of this, and then come back and join us. So Haydn also wrote a number of operas and masses, and remember, masses are sets of liturgical music for church services, in liturgical services, so Anglicans and Catholics. And his operas were in both Italian and German. 3 of them were serious operas, but most of them were comedic operas, and he was very much inspired by Handel, whose music he became acquainted with when he was living in London. Now remember, Handel was the guy that wrote the Messiah. And there's a story of Haydn when hearing the Alleluia chorus from the Messiah in Westminster Abbey. He burst into tears, being so moved, and exclaimed of Handel, "He is the master of us all." So clearly Haydn was a big fan of Handel's. In response to this and how inspired he was, Haydn also wrote 2 oratorios. Now remember, oratorios are like opera, but they're religious and they're not staged. He wrote the Creation and he wrote the Seasons, both of which he published in German and English simultaneously. So I want you to listen to Haydn's In the Beginning recitative and chorus from Creation. It's the second piece in Creation. And if you want to get a really great introduction, listen to the first piece, which is an instrumental depiction of the world in chaos before it was formed, the earth without void and without being. So, but I want you to listen to this In the Beginning. It's the second piece. Listen for this minor dark sound describing God creating light. And then when the chorus says, "And there was light," you're going to hear this big bombastic C major chord for when light shows up, and it's just fabulous. So take a listen to that and then come back. All right, we are going to move on now to Mr. Mozart. The other composer that we're going to take a look at today, and the last composer we're going to look at for the classical era. Now Mozart, he was born in 1756, died in 1791. He was only 35 when he died, and he knew Haydn. They both had great respect for each other, even though Mozart was 24 years younger than him. But Haydn even once told Mozart's father Leopold, "Your son is the greatest composer known to me either in person or by name." And that's a big deal because Haydn was a rock star in Europe at the time. So that's a big deal. Mozart's father Leopold, who was a violinist and who worked for the Archbishop of Salzburg, was Mozart's first teacher. He trained both Wolfgang and he trained Wolfgang's sister Maria Anna. They were both pianists, and Mozart also became a great violinist. Now little Mozart and his sister, beginning when Mozart was 6, they went on music tours through Europe, where Mozart would play the piano, he'd sight-read concertos, he improvised fugues and fantasias and arias, and musicians would test him wherever he went. And so he began to develop a reputation as a very small child. So when he was 7 or 8, his family went on a 3.5-year music tour of Europe. 3.5 years. His first compositions were produced when he was 5. His first symphony was written by the time he was 9. He wrote his first oratorio by age 11, and his first opera by age 12. What have we all been doing with our lives? Mozart heard music all over Europe thanks to his travels. He met J.C. Bach. Mozart also, at 16, was when he took his first job. It was unpaid, but he worked for the Archbishop of Salzburg. Even though he really didn't want to write church music, he really wanted to write opera. And in his 20s, he was commissioned to write an opera for Munich, which he did. And the Archbishop got upset and was like, "Yo, come back to Salzburg," which he kind of did begrudgingly, and then he quit, because this is Mozart. And he worked as a freelance musician in Vienna. which is where he became good friends with Haydn, who used to visit there regularly. And it's also where he first heard the music of J.S. Bach, this is the more famous Bach, and became familiar with Handel's work. And like today, working as a freelance musician can be tough and unpredictable. Mozart did have a good number of students to teach, and he was very successful in publishing his music. He wrote over 600 works, including several operas, 17 masses, one requiem that he almost finished, 55 symphonies, and some various other works. But as we'll see, that didn't necessarily translate into financial security. Right now, what I'd like you to listen to is his piano sonata in F major. This is cataloged as K332. You're going to hear a lot of diverse styles, at least if you're listening for them, which this would have been kind of wild back in his day, these very diverse styles of music. You're going to hear it opens with a very song-like, beautiful tune, and you're going to hear in the left hand what kind of resembles some Alberti bass. Remember that, the broken arpeggios? By measure 5, we're going to hear some Bach-like counterpoint. And in measure 12, you're going to hear what's called hunting style, which these are notes that can be played on an open harmonic series on a natural horn. So imagine if you're playing a brass instrument and you don't press any of the valves, you just do the harmonic series. This is kind of the sound you're going to get. And then in measure 23, you're going to hear what would have then been called Sturm und Drang, which is storm and drive, which is a very passionate, dissonant, emotional German style. So I want you to take a listen to the first bit of this, at least up through those first 25 measures or so, and listen for these different styles. Can you identify each of the differences? It's a little challenging, but see if you can. If you really want to stretch yourself, listen to the whole song, because this is sonata form. Can you identify the exposition, the development, and the recapitulation? And here's a hint. This is more set up in a two-part structure instead of a three-part structure where the development is its own movement. The development is part of the second half, so when they do the repeat of the second half, you will hear the development again, which wouldn't be normal for later styles of sonata. So take a listen to this and then come back and join us for a little more on Mozart, which, by the way, this painting on here, that's an image of little Mozart playing the piano with his sister and his father. So Mozart's operas, not unlike his piano sonatas, his concertos, and his symphonies, blended a huge variety of styles. In Die Entführung aus dem Serail, which is the German opera he was commissioned to write for Munich, he adds an element of Turkish music. In The Marriage of Figaro, in Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutti, which are some of his well-known Italian operas, he has a mixture of both serious and comedic characters, which this is crazy. You can have both. Like, you can have a diversity of emotional ranges. That's awesome. So we've got a mixture of opera seria and opera buffa. And in his last opera, The Magic Flute, which also has some spoken content in it, it's not all sung, so it gets classified sometimes as Singspiel, which is a type of German opera with some spoken language in it. It's considered the first great German opera. So what I'd like you to listen to from The Magic Flute is the Queen of the Night aria. This is considered one of the most challenging arias ever written, and I shared with you some, I think one of our classes I shared with you the original, and I've also shared with you some kind of comedic takes with goats and marmots of it. But I want you to listen to the full original aria, and this is done by Maria Callas, who is a famous opera singer in the mid-20th century, and her rhythm isn't perfect, but her tone is just, it's one of my favorites. So take a listen. For context, this is the moment where the Queen of the Night comes down and she's raging at her daughter Parmina, who is considering joining a religious group because this guy she loves is joining it. This isn't a cult. This is like weird made-up mythology kind of stuff, but not even real mythology. It's just weird. And of course her mom's like, how dare you? Because she has some grudges against this group, and she's jealous, and so she tells her daughter, okay, here's a dagger, you need to kill this guy you love or I'm going to disown you. And this is that moment where she's threatening to disown her and giving her a dagger. So enjoy enjoy this Queen of the Night aria, which is actually the second aria that the Queen of the Night sings in this opera, and it's about how the fury of hell rages in her heart. So take a listen and then come back and join us again. All right, now, as I mentioned, Mozart did pretty well as far as making money, but he didn't do a good job hanging on to his money. And in fact, when he died at 35, he was buried in a pauper's grave, and they had to go back later when he was more famous and identify it. Um, so, yeah, he could have done better in that regard. But fortunately, his wife had great business acumen, and she was also part of the reason that his music was well popularized after his death. So, not long after his death, though, rumors began to swirl that he was poisoned by a rival composer, and in the late 19th century, that was turned into a play by the Russian writer Pushkin. Very shortly after that, it was made into a ballet by the Russian composer Rimsky-Korsakov, and then it was adapted in I think 1979 into another play by American playwright Peter Shaffer, and then in the 80s that was turned into a film that goes by the same name as the play called Amadeus. And as much fun as all that is, the truth is he most likely just got a fever and died. Um, as far as we can tell, he was not poisoned, and as far as we can tell, the guy that's blamed for it, Antonio Salieri, they were probably at least friends. Maybe just casual acquaintances, but no big rivalry. That probably isn't true, but it's fun. Um, what is true, though, is that the Requiem that he was writing when he died was commissioned anonymously by him, but the guy who commissioned it was not Salieri. It was a guy by the name of Count Valsek. And he did the commission for this Requiem, and which a Requiem is, again, a mass, so a set of liturgical music for church, but it's for the dead, so it's something you sing at someone's funeral. And it was unfinished at Mozart's death and was later finished by a student of his. What I want you to listen to from it is the Dies Irae. This movement Mozart didn't write out in its entirety, but it was sketched out. Just it had to be orchestrated later by other people. And this particular part of a Requiem, the Dies Irae, describes the judgment of God. So, I want you to take a listen to it. It's a really great piece. And then I want you to come back for one more quick slide. So just really quick, if you need some ideas for classical era composers that you can use, here are the ones that we've talked about. There are plenty more you can reference, but here are the ones we've talked about. We talked about Domenico Alberti. We talked about C.P.E. Bach. We talked about J.C. Bach, which is London Bach and the youngest. William Billings with his Continental Harmony. Christoph Gluck. Joseph Haydn, and today Mozart, and of course Domenico Scarlatti. So these are options for you for the classical era. And now we're going to get into Beethoven and the Romantic era. So I'll see you next week.